It was just another busy evening at the restaurant, and James, a hard-working waiter, was rushing from table to table, making sure every customer was taken care of. He had been working long shifts, saving up for his dreams, and doing his best to stay positive despite the struggles he faced. Then he noticed an elderly man sitting alone in the corner, struggling to eat his meal. The man's hands trembled, and he seemed to have difficulty holding his fork. Without hesitation, James walked over, crouched beside him, and softly asked, "Would you like some help?" The older man looked up, his tired eyes filled with a mixture of embarrassment and gratitude. James didn't wait for an answer. He simply picked up the fork and began cutting the food into smaller pieces before gently feeding the man, making sure he felt comfortable and respected. Other diners glanced over, some smiling, some whispering, but James didn't care. To him, kindness didn't need an audience. What James didn't know was that this small act of compassion was about to change his life forever. The elderly man wasn't just any customer. He had a story of his own. And soon, James would find out just how much one good deed could truly mean. As James continued to help the elderly man, he couldn't help but notice the deep sadness in his eyes. There was something about him, something more than just old age or physical struggle. The man barely spoke, only offering a quiet thank you every now and then. James didn't push for conversation. He simply focused on making sure the man could enjoy his meal with dignity. Between serving other customers, James would glance back at the man's table, making sure he was doing okay. He noticed how some people looked on with curiosity, others with admiration, but no one else stepped forward to help. It made James think about how often people like this man were ignored, left to struggle alone in silence. After finishing his meal, the man reached into his pocket with shaky hands and pulled out a small, slightly crumpled card. He held it out to James, his expression unreadable. "I'd like to see you again," the man said softly, his voice carrying more weight than James expected. Confused but curious, James took the card and glanced at it. The name printed on it made his breath hitch. This man wasn't just anyone. But why was he here? And what did he want with James? James stared at the card in his hand, his mind racing. The name printed on it seemed familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. Before he could ask any questions, the elderly man gave him a knowing smile and slowly stood up. "I hope we meet again," he said before making his way toward the exit. James watched him go, feeling an odd mix of curiosity and unease. Something about this encounter didn't feel random. Later that night, after his shift ended, James sat in the break room, staring at the card under the harsh fluorescent light. He pulled out his phone and typed the name into a search engine. Within seconds, article after article popped up. His eyes widened as he scrolled through headlines. This man wasn't just anyone. He was a retired business mogul, once one of the most influential figures in the city. But what shocked James the most was that a few years ago, the man had vanished from the public eye. No interviews, no appearances, just silence. Why would someone like him come to a small restaurant alone? And why did he want to see James again? A strange feeling settled in James's chest. He had a choice: forget about it and move on with his life, or step into a story that could change everything. James couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter meant something bigger than he realized. The next day, as he arrived for his shift, his manager pulled him aside. "There's someone here asking for you," she said, lowering her voice. "He's waiting at table 5. James's stomach tightened. He already knew who it was. As he approached the table, the elderly man sat calmly, his hands folded on the table, his expression unreadable. "I see you looked me up," the man said with a slight smile, as if he could read James's thoughts. James hesitated before sitting across from him. "Why me?" He finally asked, "Why did you come back?" The man sighed, glancing around the restaurant before meeting James's eyes. "Because I've been looking for someone like you," he said. "Someone who understands kindness without expecting anything in return." James frowned, not sure what to say. The man reached into his pocket and slid an envelope across the table. "Inside is an address. Come there tonight if you want to hear the rest." James's heart pounded as he picked up the envelope. He could feel the weight of the moment, knowing that whatever happened next would change everything. James spent the rest of his shift distracted, his mind racing with possibilities. The envelope felt heavy in his pocket, like it carried a secret too big for him to handle. What could this man possibly want from him? And why all the mystery? As soon as his shift ended, he stepped outside into the cool night air, took a deep breath, and opened the envelope. Inside was a single slip of paper with an address scribbled in neat handwriting. No explanation, no instructions, just an address. Against his better judgment, James decided to go. His curiosity wouldn't let him walk away from whatever this was. When he arrived, he found himself in front of an old but well-maintained building in a quiet part of town. It didn't look like a business or a private home, more like a forgotten piece of history. He hesitated before knocking on the heavy wooden door. After a moment, it creaked open and a middle-aged woman peered out. "You must be James," she said, stepping aside to let him in. Inside, the atmosphere shifted. The air was thick with an unspoken weight, and James's heart pounded as he took in the room. Seated near the fireplace was the elderly man, but he wasn't alone. Across from him sat a well-dressed man in his 50s, his piercing gaze locked onto James the moment he entered. "You're finally here," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "We have a lot to discuss." James had no idea what he had just walked into, but one thing was clear. This was bigger than he ever imagined. James's pulse quickened as he stepped further into the dimly lit room. The older man gestured for him to sit, while the well-dressed stranger watched him carefully. There was something about his presence, calm, powerful, like he was used to being in control. James sat stiffly, waiting for someone to speak. The elderly man finally broke the silence. "James, I never told you my full story," he said, his voice carrying a weight of unfinished business. "Years ago, I built a company from the ground up. It was my life's work. But when my health declined, I had to step away. I trusted the wrong people, and I lost everything." He glanced at the man beside him, who remained expressionless, "including my family." James furrowed his brows, confused about where he fit into all of this. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. The other man leaned forward. "Because he's my father," he said, his voice cold. "And the only reason I'm here is because of you." James looked between them, stunned. The pieces clicked together. This wasn't just about kindness. This was about redemption. The son who had once turned his back on his father had seen James's simple act of compassion and realized what he had lost. James sat in silence, realizing he had been part of something much bigger than he ever imagined. The father and son exchanged a look, years of hurt, regret, and unspoken words between them. And at that moment, James knew that his small gesture had changed more than just his own life. It had brought two lost souls back together. The room fell silent as the weight of the moment settled between them. James could see the conflict in the son's eyes. Years of resentment battling with something deeper, something more fragile. The elderly man sat still, waiting, as if he had already accepted whatever was to come. For a long time, no one spoke. Then, in a quiet, almost hesitant voice, the son finally said, "I don't know if things can ever go back to the way they were." His father nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "I don't expect them to," he replied. I just wanted to see you one last time." James felt his chest tighten. He had walked into this situation as an outsider, but now he was witnessing something rare. Two people standing at the edge of forgiveness, unsure if they had the courage to take the next step. He knew this wasn't his battle to fight, but somehow he had become part of their story. As he stood to leave, the father gave him a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, James," he said. James nodded, stepping out into the night, realizing that sometimes the smallest acts of kindness have the power to change everything.